today's video is focusing on finding the right green coffee to roast for the first time. We're going to be taking a look and understanding about coffee in general and how one coffee is different than another, and there are some big differences. And then ultimately at the end of this video, I'm going to make a recommendation for those that are first-time roasters so that you can get a great start learning how to roast coffee. This channel is devoted towards roasting coffee at home. I've got 100+ videos here on my channel that help teach people how to roast coffee at home. And it's a great hobby, but it can be overwhelming, and especially when you're first starting out. This video is the second in a series of videos for brand new home coffee roasters. The foundational videos, the first one was about finding the right coffee roaster, the best coffee roaster for you to use to roast at home. And this video is about green coffee, and then we'll talk about the actual roasting process. But if you can't wait, in the meantime, I have playlists devoted towards that. So I'd encourage you to look through the playlists, especially the secret sauce of roasting coffee at home, as well as the home coffee roasting essentials playlists. Those are really good. Also, if you've got a favorite roaster in mind, I do have playlists broken up by roasters, so check them out. When we buy green coffee, we're buying an agricultural product. Coffee is grown in a bush or a shrub, and this shrub generates fruit. The cherry is the fruit from that shrub, and inside the cherry, the seed is what we roast. It's the solubles from running hot water over these ground beans that generate this beautiful tasting coffee. And so we're going to be taking a look at some of the basics of green coffee, but we need to remember that this is an agricultural product, and there are many different types of coffee. And there are many different ways this coffee is harvested and processed, and all of this influences the way the coffee tastes, and it will influence the way the coffee roasts. That's why we're doing this video, because we want to get you started on a really good path for roasting specialty coffee. And these are coffees that are higher quality, that score higher as they are cupped, as they are tasted by coffee professionals. So specialty coffee is available from all over the world, but looking at this globe spinning around, you'll notice that there is a region of the world where most of the coffee is grown, and this is called the coffee belt. This is an area that centers from the equator and spans outward, and the growing conditions are optimal for coffee farms to be able to grow and harvest specialty coffee. If you take a closer look and you zoom in a region, you'll notice topographically that it is mountainous and very hilly, and that's where a lot of coffee is grown, is in regions like this. All right, so as we select coffee, one of the choices we're going to make is what country or what region do we want to buy coffee from. And there are differences in the way that the coffee is grown, the way that the coffee is processed after they harvest it, and that varies from country to country based on their traditions, based on their available resources. They may process the coffee differently after its harvest. They may grow different types of coffee plants because of the conditions that the coffee is growing in. So when you look at a Kenyan coffee, there tends to be certain types of coffee that might be different than coffees that are grown in Indonesia. Where the coffee is grown does make a difference in the type of coffee that you would order. So I would encourage you to learn more about coffee regions and the different types of coffee. A great resource for that is here, and I've got a link, and I'll show you this page, and you'll see the different types of coffees and specifically some of their attributes. They talk about the size of the leaf, the type of the seed or cherry that is grown, and even the types of diseases that this plant is susceptible to. It's a very interesting site. If you want to learn more about varieties or types of coffee, I would encourage you to check that out. Once you've selected an origin of the coffee, then the next choice is going to be the type of process. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, the type of process can vary based on the country that the farm is located in and the resources that are available. So you might find a lot of Ethiopian coffees that are dry process coffees, and that could be because water is not a resource that they can dispose of. It's something that's rationed, and they may not wash coffee as often traditionally because of that reason. So they have more dry process coffees. Other countries, just because of the prevalence of water, predominantly will have a washed type of processing. So let's talk about processing for a second. A wash process coffee is one type. This is where the cherry is harvested, and then the coffee, it sits for 24 to 48 hours generally. And then after that period of time, that's a fermentation period of time where the coffee cherry, or where the coffee seed, ferments inside of the cherry. The seed is removed from the cherry. This depulping process is done, and the seeds are then washed again and then laid out to dry, sometimes for a couple of weeks, depending upon the conditions. They're laid out on hard surfaces. Sometimes it's tarps, sometimes it's elevated, but this is generally how washed coffees are processed. The next type of process is a natural or a dry process. This is where the cherry is left to ferment, and it's left for several weeks without removing the seed. Then after about 3 weeks, the seed is removed from the cherry, and then the seed is left to dry again, and then it's bagged. It is not washed, and so you tend to have more fruity notes in those types of coffees that you would roast. Now, there are plenty of washed coffees that have fruity notes. Don't get me wrong, but because of the process, there is a distinct fruity note that is also part of what you're going to taste when you roast and drink a dry process coffee. All right, from there are variations of fermentation. So every coffee goes through a fermentation process as it's being processed, and we discussed what those were for washed and for dry. And a variation of that is a honey process. This is kind of where you have kind of an in-between a dry and a washed coffee. The cherry is laid out for several days, and then the seed is taken from the cherry, and instead of being washed, it's laid out. So there's a little bit of mucilage left on the seed, a little bit of the fleshiness of the fruit. Depending upon how much of that and the fermentation process, you can have a honey process, a warm honey, a red honey, a black honey process. There are a whole bunch of different honey processes to choose from as you shop. And then there's anaerobic. The seed is left in the cherry is put into a tank that has no oxygen in it, and the fermentation process takes place for several days in that tank before the coffee is then taken out and processed. And this is known as an anaerobic process, and it can have some very winey, kind of wild flavors that are also included in what the seed would have naturally generated. So the unique thing about coffee processing is you can have the exact same farm process that coffee in different ways, and you'll have different impact or different effect on the coffee that you roast and taste. It will have different tasting notes based on the way the coffee was fermented and processed. The next helpful element when we look for green coffee is the farm information. This is the details of what we're going to read and see about this coffee that we're buying. Now, the farm information tells us things like where it was grown. Was it a small farm, a family farm? They talk about the farmer. They talk about the history of the farm. They talk about the growing conditions, the soil, the types of plant that they are farming that's there, different varieties or different types that are listed there, the elevation that the coffee is grown. All of these things are really important, and some of them will impact the way the coffee will taste when we roast it. So it's important for us to read the farm information, and it's going to be very helpful. Little clues about farm information, and one of my favorite, other than process and the type of coffee, is the altitude. The altitude of where this coffee is grown is going to give us an idea of the conditions, the environmental conditions, the weather that this plant is growing in, and ultimately the density of the seed. Higher elevation coffee usually means slower growing plants. It means fewer harvests per year, 2 maybe instead of 3. And it means that the seed, because it's growing slower, by its nature is going to be more compact, more dense. And that density is something that is important to coffee roasting people. It helps them understand a little bit about how that coffee is going to roast. I love high density coffees. I love coffees that are grown at high elevations. And one of the reasons why is because they tend to be less susceptible to roasting defects as we roast coffee. If you're new to home coffee roasting and you're trying to learn how to manage your heat, sometimes we apply too much heat. Some coffees can get little blotchy black spots from scorching or from tipping on the seed while we're roasting it, and those are called roasting defects. Those are things that you can taste after you've roasted the coffee. You don't want that to happen, and so higher density coffees tend to be a little less prone to roasting defects. So that's why I like high density coffees. Take a look at the harvest date. That's really important because you don't want to have a harvest date that's really old. Ideally, it's good for you to find coffees that are less than a year old, harvested a year old. Even better yet, 6 or 7 months would be better, or even a few months, that would be awesome. It usually takes several months for coffee to be harvested, processed, dried, and then packaged and shipped. There have been supply chain issues, and this has caused some coffees to come in a little later than planned, but just don't buy a coffee that's 2 years old. If you don't see when the coffee was harvested or when it was brought into the country, then I would maybe steer away from that type of coffee. So farming information is really huge. And then either the importer or the seller of the coffee will taste and test and cup the coffee. Usually when they roast this coffee, they're sampling at different roast levels so that they can describe to you what the coffee tastes like at different roast levels. This is really helpful as well because it gives you an idea of the potential or what you can expect from that coffee. All right, now for my recommendation for the first coffee that you try roasting. And that would be a Central American coffee. That's the region. The country would be Guatemala. I would encourage you to look at Guatemalan coffees. And here's why I like them. I like them because they tend not to be too acidic. So for those that want a little bit of fruit note, you'll get that from a Guatemalan. But you can also roast it in a way where you'll get the chocolatey notes. You'll get the milk chocolate. You'll get some sweetness. And that is really what I love. It's a very diverse coffee. And if you buy one that is grown at an elevation of 12 or 1,400 meters above sea level or higher, chances are you're going to be falling into the higher density coffees. You'll have a coffee that is less prone to roasting defects. And it'll be just generally an all-around good coffee that you can roast at a variety of roast levels and still have a good outcome. So I'll have some links to the sellers, as I mentioned, and they're not all the sellers, but these are sellers that I've used in the past. I've got about 5 of them that I've purchased from. I'm not sponsored. I'm not promoting any one seller. And I think if you start looking, look to see how each of these sellers presents their information and find one that you like. And by the way, there are some sellers that actually have, they all have cupping notes and what they taste, as I mentioned before, but some go even greater, even further, and they are very specific about body, about sweetness, about fruit, and they measure each of those elements. And so you might want to look and see and find sellers that do that and which sellers you feel comfortable with buying. And then, of course, price is always a factor as well. So these are people that are promoting and supporting home coffee roasting hobbyists. So you want to shop around and try different sellers. I would encourage that. It's important for you to support various sellers. And I would love to hear your thoughts about my suggestions, about the things that I shared in this video. If you've got experience buying green coffee and you want to make recommendations to your favorite greens, go ahead and do that. No spamming, but just be sincere and share your experiences. I would appreciate that. If you've got questions, ask those in the comments. And if you've got something to share, do that as well. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope you have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time. Take care.